Hi guys, my name's George Agumbar and I'm here today with Musiciangoods TV, the place to go for all things music production. Today we're going to be talking about compression. Personally, I think this can be one of the most challenging effects to hear and to understand, especially when you first start using it. But we're going to take it slow and work from the very basics and build it up from there. Hopefully this video will be a bit of a guide for you and help you feel more comfortable with it. We'll be looking at what compression is, why we use it and what the parameters do. We'll then talk about why it can be so hard to hear, how to train your ears to hear it, and we'll do a bit of a practice listening for compression. And then finally we'll have a look at how compression can change the feel of the energy of a song. So let's get into it. To begin to understand compression, we should understand how it works. When you compress something in real life, you reduce it in volume or in size. And that's pretty much how compression works in music production too. It reduces the dynamic range of a track, so the louder and the quieter parts of the track are closer in volume. There are two types of compression, downwards compression and upwards compression. And for our purposes, downwards compression is probably the most common. With downwards compression, the loudest parts of the track are turned down to make them closer in volume to the quieter parts. We decide which parts of the audio are turned down by setting a level, above which the signal gets compressed. This level is called the threshold. Any signal above the threshold will be turned down. The opposite of this is upwards compression, where the quieter parts of the track are turned up to make them closer in volume to the louder parts of the track. There are three main reasons that we may choose to use compression. Number one, it makes a track sound more professional. You haven't got these large peaks and troughs and variation in the signal level. And because the signal level is much more consistent, your track sounds much more professional. Number two, we can change the feel of the energy of a track, which we'll look at in much more detail later on. But using compression, we can change a track's attack and release times. And this can make a track sound a lot more energetic or a lot more laid back. And we tend to use this mostly on vocals and drums. But as a quick example, if I sang a line with a lot of attack, it would sound like this. And I'm like, hey, I miss you. And then if I sang it with less attack, it would sound like this. And I'm like, hey, I miss you. And you can hear that those two examples sounded completely different in terms of their feel and in terms of their energy. And we can use compression to get a similar result. Number three, we can change the tone of the track that we're compressing. And this is due to how different compressors and different emulations of compressors have varying circuits and algorithms in them, which gives each model or each compressor its own unique tone. And that's why often you'll hear that engineers or producers have favourite compressors to use on certain tracks and certain instruments. Have you ever looked at a compressor or opened up a compressor plugin and been completely overwhelmed by the magnitude of dials and numbers? I certainly felt that way when I started out. I was completely lost. But actually, if you learn what each parameter does, one by one, I promise that it gets a lot easier to understand. So let's have a look at the general parameters that you'll find on a compressor and what they do. The threshold parameter allows us to set the level at which the audio has to be for the compressor to begin to compress. So if we have a threshold set to -20 dB, any audio louder than -20 dB will be reduced in level. Next is the ratio. This decides how strong the compression effect is going to be. If you have a ratio of 2:1, you essentially have a halving of signal, and a ratio of 4:1 will be a quartering. So with 2:1, any signal above the threshold level will be halved. So if the signal was 4 decibels above the threshold, it will be reduced to 2 decibels above the threshold. If it was 8 decibels above the threshold, it would be reduced to 4 decibels above, and so on. With downwards compression, our audio tends to get reduced in level, and that's when we use the makeup gain to increase the track's overall level after compression. We also have some auto gain options, which will set the track's final gain for us. By their nature, compressors are designed to come in at a time that we set manually, and we determine how quickly the compression comes in and how quickly it kicks out by changing the attack and release parameters. The attack time is how quickly the compressor kicks in after the audio surpasses the threshold, and the release time is how long it takes for the compression to turn off after the audio has fallen below the threshold value. There's then this very bizarre thing called the knee, and this is on most compressors. This is really important because it changes how obvious the compression sounds. It controls how abrupt the transition from uncompressed to compressed audio is. A soft knee is a smoother, more gradual change. You can see on the graph that the point is quite rounded. A hard knee is more sudden and harsh, and the point is a lot less round. And these are the general parameters that you will find on most compressors. And so those are the general parameters that you will find on the majority of compressors and compressor plugins. My best advice for when you're starting out would be to learn and to get to know one parameter at a time. It makes the compressor a lot quicker and a lot easier to learn, and it makes it seem a lot less daunting. We're all guilty of using compression for the sake of it. We know that we should be using it because everyone says we should. But actually sometimes we can't hear the effect that it's having on our track. But why is this? Why is it so difficult to hear? I mean, we can all admit that hearing effects such as reverb and delay is a lot easier. I think that the first thing to note is that compressors are designed to sound natural. They're meant to make your track sound polished in a natural way, and you're not supposed to necessarily be able to hear that it's there. And so it's in a compressor's nature to be difficult to hear. I also think that compression is quite a challenging effect to hear because its effects happen over a long segment of audio. It happens over a longer period of time. And because it may only be subtly affecting the audio over a longer period of time, that makes it a lot more tricky to hear. It may only be tweaking a few syllables here and there. And finally, I think that compression is also quite tricky to hear due to the way that our ears detect sound. The human ear is designed to work over a huge range of sound intensities, from a very quiet whisper to a large explosion, and in order to be able to do this, the ear has its own inbuilt compression. And so very small changes in volume in the mid to upper ranges of sound intensity are appreciated much less well. And that's one of the reasons that you should mix at lower volumes, because our ears are better at distinguishing changes at lower volumes. But at louder volumes, the music sounds more exciting because our ears are naturally compressing it. Now, I know that I've just said that compression is really hard to hear, and it is, but luckily there are ways that we can train our ears to listen out for it. The best advice I can give would be to really over-exaggerate compression on your track. Turn that compressor up really high until you can begin to hear it. And when you begin to hear the effects of the compressor, bring it back a bit, turn the compression down a bit. You want to make sure that you're really concentrating on the volume of the track and not the track itself. I know that I said compression can change the tone of a track, and you may want to listen out for that. But a compressor's main job is to reduce the track's dynamic range. I would advise that you really concentrate on the beginning and the ends of words, as this is where the transients are, where the most energy of the sound normally lies. And so these are the parts that the compressor is most likely to affect. And as with most effects, I would always recommend that you listen to the effects of the compressor on your track, not in isolation, but in the mix. Personally, I find it a lot easier to hear compression on a track when it's in relation to a mix and when it's not being soloed. Now, this may all seem really hard to hear at the beginning, but this is something that gets a lot easier and a lot better with time and with plenty of practice, I promise. So I wanted to give you guys a resource to helping hearing compression. I've recorded a vocal, which you'll hear twice. Once will be with compression and once will be without. But I won't tell you which is which until after, so you can try and see whether you can hear the effects the compressor is having on the track. And I'm like, hey, I miss you. Do you think that maybe you miss me too. And I'm like, hey. And I'm like, hey, I miss you. Do you think that maybe you miss me too? And I'm like, hey, I want you, and I want to find from you if you miss me, how I miss you. I miss you. I want you, and I want to find from you if you miss me, how I miss you. I miss you. I miss you. Do you miss me? Do you miss me? How I miss you too. And I'm like, hey, I miss you. Do you miss me? Do you miss me? I miss you. Do you miss me? Do you miss me? How I miss you too. And I'm like, hey, I miss you. Do you miss me? Do you miss me? Earlier, I touched upon the fact that we can use compression to change the feel of the energy of a track. And I just wanted to talk about that in a bit more detail now that we understand the basics of compression. We can use different compression strategies for different types of music. For example, if we had a rock song and a ballad, we'd want different feels and different energies to each of these songs. For a rock song, we'd want a much more energetic, punchy sound. And for a ballad, we want a much more relaxed and laid-back sound. And this is where the attack and release parameters come in. These control how our compressor kicks in and out of our track. So let's start by having a look at the attack parameter. A slow attack, which is normally above 50 milliseconds, will make the sound quite punchy. The initial energy of a sound, which engineers call the initial transient, is usually the loudest part of the sound. This isn't being compressed, so the attack is retained before the compression kicks in. A fast attack time does the opposite. It would tame these initial transients. You just had to be careful that the fast attack time doesn't make your track sound lifeless and distant by getting rid of these transients completely. Here's an example of a vocal with no compression, and then compression with a slow attack, and then compression with a fast attack. Make sure when listening to these examples that you pay attention to the beginning of the words, the initial transients. And I'm like, hey, I miss you. Do you think that maybe you miss me too? And I'm like, hey. And I'm like, hey, I miss you. Do you think that maybe you miss me too? And I'm like, hey. And I'm like, hey, I miss you. Do you think that maybe you miss me too? And I'm like, hey. So you may have heard that the slow attack gave us a much more energetic feel than the fast attack by allowing the energy at the beginning of the words to come through before the compressor started doing its job. Now let's have a look at the release times. A slow release time, which is normally above 250 milliseconds, gives your track a more sustained and controlled sound. You need to be careful though, not to set this too long, as it could be that the compressor hasn't kicked out before the next transient comes in, meaning that your track will lose its liveliness because it's lost those initial transients in the next word. A fast release time, which is normally 100 milliseconds or under, gives you again a punchier sound, as sounds will drop more suddenly in level. This can make your track seem more forward in the mix. But again, you have to be careful, as with extremely short release times, you can sometimes find that your track gets these pumping artifacts, which you don't really want. Again, here are the vocal examples without compression, and then with a slow and a fast release time. This time round, you want to make sure to concentrate on the ends of words and the sustain of the track. And I'm like, hey, I miss you. Do you think that maybe you miss me too? And I'm like, hey. And I'm like, hey, I miss you. Do you think that maybe you miss me too? And I'm like, hey. And I'm like, hey, I miss you. Do you think that maybe you miss me too? And I'm like, hey. The slow release time certainly sounded more sustained, whilst the fast release time sounded more punchy. And that's how we can use attack and release times to change the feel of the energy of a track. That's my brief guide on compression for producers and engineers. Please don't get disheartened. Compression is known to be a very complicated effect. And that's because it's hard to hear. It's got lots of parameters, and all these parameters interact with each other. But the more you use it, the more you learn about it, and the more you practice hearing for it, the easier it will become. And we don't just have to use compression on a track directly. We can use it in more creative ways, such as sidechain compression and parallel compression, and perhaps we can make another video on those in the future. Thank you so much for watching this video. Please let us know what you thought in the comments below, and make sure you like and subscribe to Musiciangoods TV. My name is George Agumbar. You can find me on the socials at George Agumbar or on YouTube at Third Fret. Thank you so much for watching this video, and I will see you again soon.